As we reason through the Bible, we come across passages that are sometimes dealing with very, very different things. And some Bible passages deal with end times, on what's going to happen at the end of days. Some Bible passages deal with how to live our lives on a daily basis. Some of them teach us about the nature of God. The passage we have before us today in Matthew 24 deals with what's going to happen at the end of days. We're starting at verse 4. Just a little bit of review before we jump in, because context is always important. Jesus, of course, is in the last few days of his life. He's in Jerusalem. He's been in the Temple Mount dealing with the Pharisees, the leaders of the country. Chapter 23, he was very blunt, spent the entire chapter raking the Pharisees over the cold, calling them names, essentially forcing them to deal with him.
Right.
Jesus picked the time of his death, and then because of that severe dealing with the Pharisees, at the beginning of chapter 24, they go out to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples are pointing out the beautiful temple building.
The opulence.
The opulence of the temple as they go out. See, Lord, look at all these buildings. And they ask 3 questions of the Lord, because he had been talking about some grand things of when the temple was going to be destroyed. So, Steve, what are the 3 questions they ask in Matthew 24, verse 3?
They say, when will these things happen? Referring to the temple being torn down. When will be the sign of your coming? And what will be the sign of the end of the age?
And so Jesus basically deals with the last 2 of those questions and doesn't really answer when will these things happen. But
well, let me say this, is that what we have recorded in Matthew is the answer to the last 2. I'm sure that he did deal with the first question, but here in Matthew 24, it's what he's recording, right? It's
correct.
What we have.
And as we had mentioned before, they probably spent the afternoon out there on the Mount of Olives talking about these things.
Right.
And we have something you can read in 5-10 minutes.
Yeah.
And so we don't have everything Jesus said.
No.
On top of that, the same talk is given over in Luke and in Mark.
Yeah.
But they're similar things, but Luke and Mark bring out some differences.
Right.
In what he says. So we can't always say, even though all of these are on that same day from the Mount of Olives, the questions that are recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke are slightly different, and the answers are slightly different. So we're taking what's here in Matthew.
Correct.
And we built a case in the last couple of our sessions that we believe this is future, and we gave it a long series of reasons for that. And so let's read here in Matthew 24 and see what Jesus' answer is to these questions. So I'm starting in verse 4. Jesus answered them and said, "See to it that no one misleads you, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and will mislead many. You will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But all these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs." So when they ask these questions, Steve, what is the first thing in verse 4 that Jesus tells them? The very first thing.
Don't be misled.
And so why would he say that first?
Because in the next verse, he says there's going to be many that are going to come saying, "I am the Messiah." And so he's forewarning them, don't be misled by these people coming, giving you different information, the information that's different from what I have been giving to you.
And in fact, one of the recurring themes in this chapter is that same idea. He says it first, right out of the chute. Do not be deceived.
Right.
The next verse, many will come in my name. Verse 11, many false prophets will arise and will deceive many. Verse 24, false Christ and false prophets will arise.
Right.
So he's warning us that there's going to be the opportunity out here for false teachers and false Christ and false prophets to deceive us.
And the words that he uses there, see to it that no one misleads you. The connotation that I get is that it's not just a passive, don't be misled. It's see to it. In other words, to me, it's like study up, be aware, know what I'm telling you so that you won't be misled by somebody else.
If you're aware of a con man,
Yeah.
then you're much less likely to be
Conned
by the con man.
Right.
If you're naive and you believe everybody that you bump into, then chances are somebody's going to con you out of your money.
You know, one thing,
or in this case, con you out of your soul.
Yeah. One thing a word picture is that people that blow or the illustration of a tree blowing in the wind, that the leaves and branches blow in the direction of whichever way go in the direction of whichever way the wind's blowing. And so we shouldn't be like that in regards to Scripture. We should know what the Scripture is and we should study it. If we don't study it and we just listen to other people that teach it or interpret it or preach it, and then don't go and proof it out for ourselves, then we're basically, if there's conflicting there, it's the blowing in the wind, and you're like a tree that's just blowing whichever way that the last wind direction that blew. So we encourage our listeners to go and study what it is that we're going through, whatever book it is, and proof it out and not just take us at face value of what we're saying.
When Paul in the book of Acts went to Berea, the Bereans were said to be more noble because they read the Scriptures and verified what Paul was saying.
Right.
And so I submit here that what Jesus is saying so many times in this one chapter, to watch out, don't be deceived. The reason why is because there's a lot of deception out there.
Yeah.
There's a lot of opportunities to be deceived.
Right.
And great point you brought up, Steve. What he's implying here is take action.
Mm-hmm.
Don't be passive. Be active. Be on the lookout. Be ready for false teachers to come along, and don't be so naive that you believe everybody just because they say God words that they're going to be believed. Are there people still today that are running around the countryside being false prophets? And
Yeah. And many times when you really listen to what they say, these prophets, it's information that comes out of the newspaper. You know, so a lot of them I feel are just well read, and they maybe have additional sources, and they really just listen to them. It's nothing really new. It's things that they say are a word from God, but yet it's still a little bit of an open-ended. And when you really listen to them and compare them to the word that God gave to the actual prophets from the Old Testament, you can see a lot of holes in things that they are saying. So we should be aware. We should be very wary of people going around claiming that they are themselves, proclaiming themselves to be a prophet.
I see at least two different categories of these. One is false teachers in doing exactly what you just said. They'll pick verses here and there and there and try to build a case, and then a lot of things out of the news. Right. And try to sucker people into, hey, this end times thing's happening over here.
Right.
That's one category. Another one is there's people that have just a dynamic personality that become these false Messiah figures that really don't know very much of anything about the Scriptures. But because of their personality, they gather a group of people around them, and oftentimes those are personality cults,
right,
that end up following this one dynamic person, that oftentimes this ends up very badly. There's been false messiahs over the years that come up. It seems like every few years there's a false messiah that comes up, and people end up in death.
Yeah, one example that comes to mind that he doesn't claim to be a prophet, but he's from over in the Louisiana area, and he has a long, convoluted story about where he was taken into heaven one time, and he's worked it into, he's got it down pretty good where he can get it into a 30-minute message and session. And he tells little jokes along the way, and it makes it a little bit lighthearted along the way. But the whole crux of it is that he was taken into heaven. He saw the place where the mansion that's built for him, even the furniture that's there, and that Jesus came up to him and put his arms around him, and that he was, buddy with Jesus. And it all comes down to that Jesus told him, go back and tell the people that I'm coming. That was the gist of it. But here's the deal. And of course, it's very entertaining of the storytelling, typical storyteller. Here's the deal is, by doing that, he's elevating himself to the same level as Paul. Paul was taken into heaven. And so here you have a guy, and believe me, this person is not a Paul. There's a lot of teachings that he has which are very, very off base. And so here he is. By doing this, he has elevated himself to a status that's equal to Paul the Apostle, as well as others. And there's you just got to look at that and say, forget about even the teaching that he has.
Right.
This is something that's way out of the normal.
Right. There's the parable that Jesus taught about the rich man and Lazarus that ended up dying, teaches that there is a great gulf fixed between us and heaven, and we don't cross it.
Right.
So verse 5 gives us a clue as to how many people are going to be out there either deceiving or being deceived. So what word does it use there in verse 5 to kind of give a clue for how common this is going to be?
Well, it says many will come.
Many.
There's going to be a lot of
them.
Yeah.
And I didn't give a specific number, but he says many.
Yeah.
So it's not going to be just a few. This is going to happen a lot. Will there be false prophets that arise and claim to be the Savior and Messiah? Yeah. 2 Corinthians 11:4 warns Christians about another Jesus with a different spirit and a different gospel. So we've been warned in multiple places in the New Testament to watch out for false teachers, false Jesuses, and with a different spirit. And so sometimes people say, I believe in Jesus, and I feel like asking them which one.
Yeah.
The true one or the false one.
Right.
Because again, 2 Corinthians 11:4 says there's going to be other Jesuses with a different gospel and a different spirit.
Yep.
So he's saying from the very first here, be careful. Don't be deceived. There's going to be a lot of false teaching out there. Then verse 6 and 7 talk about wars, famines, earthquakes. Mm-hmm. These things are very frightening.
Right.
And those things all cause mass death.
Yeah.
And when you're near them, of course, natural human tendency, be afraid of war.
Yeah.
And famine and earthquakes. What does Jesus command about those things in verse 6? What is he telling us? You're going to hear about all these things, but what?
That's not the end. Don't be frightened because they're going to take place, but that's not the end, right?
Right. So he's telling us in advance there's going to be all these issues, and you're going to hear all these stories. You're going to hear society talking about war. Oh, war's coming. Ooh. Or here's a famine that's going to come. Or here's this earthquake. Or here's this disease. Or here's this. Well, he's saying don't panic.
Right.
I know about these things. I'm telling you in advance it's coming. No reason to worry. Does God know about all these problems that we're going to go through?
Yeah, he does.
And so that's the main message here at the beginning. Don't be deceived and don't panic. There's no reason to run around with your hair on fire, all freaking out, worried about it, when he says, don't worry. I got it under control. Yeah, there's going to be bad times coming, but don't worry.
Right.
That's what he's telling us. So both Jesus' words and common human experience tell us that many people encounter great hardships in life. Will we ever encounter great human misery potentially in our lifetime? Well, yeah. I mean, if you look at past generations, that's happened.
Right.
Is there going to be human misery such that no one ever in the history of the world has ever encountered? Well, there's going to be a tribulation period.
Right.
But other people have gone through wars.
Yeah.
Other people have gone through famines. Other people have gone through earthquakes and diseases and all these things.
Yeah.
So he's saying, don't lose your wits about you. Steve, read the next few verses. Start at verse 9 and go to 14.
Then they will deliver you to tribulation and will kill you, and you will be hated by nations because of my name. At that time, many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and mislead many. Because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come.
So he's saying here in verse 9, they're going to deliver you up to tribulation and are going to kill you, and you're going to be hated by all nations on account of my name, just for naming the name of Christ. And that could happen at any age. Those things happened to the disciples,
right,
that he was speaking there. It's also happened to many Christians across the centuries. Seems like some Christians in every generation are persecuted and even killed for no other reason than being Christian. And so I submit that that's good advice regardless of what generation you're in, is that we should be prepared to have severe persecution for no more nor less than we claim to be a follower of Jesus Christ. There will be people that hate us for that.
Yeah.
And there's people in, again, every generation that are persecuted and killed and suffer for no more nor less than saying, I'm a follower of Jesus Christ.
Right. And there's also been a lot of great persecution in other areas of the world, and there's been less persecution in other areas of the world as well. But there has been persecution throughout all of the generations, no less.
And he had alluded back in verse 6 that we hear about all these problems. That's not the end yet.
Right.
So there's going to be tribulation. There's going to be great tribulation. Times are going to get worse and worse. That's what he's saying here. And so I submit that all of us should be mentally prepared for the absolute worst. What happens if somebody threatens my life? What do I do if I lose everything material world? What happens if I'm thrown into mass chaos? Am I going to deny my Lord, or am I going to use that as an opportunity to reach out around me and save some around me? The times that I've been in situations where there was kind of a mass fear in society, great time for evangelism.
Yeah.
People are looking, they're hungry during those times. When people are on the other end of the spectrum, are really happy, times are good, everybody's well fed, they've got plenty of jobs and money, it's a lot harder to evangelize. But when people feel like, hey, everything I know is falling apart here, they're looking for a savior. They're looking for something to hang on to. That's a great time to evangelize. If you liked what you heard, subscribe to Reasoning Through the Bible today. Don't miss this opportunity to grow in your knowledge and love of God's Word. Subscribe to Reasoning Through the Bible on your favorite podcast platform.
Yeah, and we've seen that throughout history. In that times of great conflict or cataclysm, people will go to churches and seek fellow Christians out that maybe they've had conversations with throughout their life to ask them, hey, what do you think's going on? And so again, as you point out, it's a good time for us to give our testimony and to tell them why that we're at peace in relation to it, and that these things are things that are said that were going to happen. Now, we do have history. I mean, there in verse 7, when it says nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, that's a Jewish idiom for, like a worldwide conflict. We have history, and we've seen in the last 150 years, one thing that Jesus compares it to in verse 8 is that's the beginning of birth pangs. Well, what happens when the labor of a person that's being born, right? Those labor pains get closer and closer together in timing, and also more and more intense. And if we just look at the last century or so, we've seen world wars. We've seen information increase and technology increase, and all the ability and the different cataclysmic things that have happened, tens of millions of people that have been starved on purpose by governments, that have been killed on purpose by governments. And so the last 100 or so years has been a lot more cataclysmic than the years before that. And so we can see that we're always going to be hurtling towards that time period of Jesus when he's coming again.
If we look at 4,000 years of known human history, the amount of knowledge that existed for most of that time, the amount of technology that existed for most of that time, the amount of human achievement that existed for most of that time was fairly stable.
Yeah.
In the last few generations, right at the end of those thousands of years in our day, information doubles, and it's doubling at a faster rate. Technology doubles and is doubling at a faster rate.
Yeah.
The speed of society is increasing all the time, and it's increasing at an exponential rate. And so everything in our life, information flow, technology, everything about us is changing, and it's changing faster and faster. And so likewise, both the good and the bad. Some of the good things are changing. We have a lot of good things that's come along with information and technology, but the evil is also doubling and coming faster and faster. So it seems like the opportunities for evil people are coming quicker, and they're more intense, just like birth pangs.
And can be disseminated a lot fuller and greater than it's ever been before.
So we have here him telling us, you're going to hear about wars. You're going to hear about famines, earthquakes. Don't panic. It's just the beginning. He's like saying, don't worry, it's going to get worse.
Right.
And so in that sense, he's saying, because if we realize that the Lord's going to be in control here, no matter how bad it gets, then we shouldn't panic at any given moment.
Yeah, and we should read the headlines in regards to what's going on, but we shouldn't necessarily try and read the headlines back into the prophecies and the things that have been talking about, because it is going to get worse, and it's going to continue to get worse, and we're told to. People will come up to me and sometimes they'll, after something that happens or the way that things are, and they'll say, well, what do you think? What do you think's going on? You think we're close? And I'll just say, we're closer today than we were yesterday to Jesus' second coming, right? That's the way it's always going to be. Every day is always closer and closer and closer and closer. So I don't try and put the specific times on it or anything else like that. We shouldn't, but we should be watchful and aware. Jesus talks about that in a little bit later here in this chapter, but we shouldn't worry or panic. I mean, the actual word he uses there in 6 is frightened, right?
Yes.
Don't be scared. Don't be frightened. And we shouldn't be. There's going to be persecution. I do believe that that's coming. It's going to get worse and it's going to get more. But as a believer, we have security that Jesus has conquered death. For a lost person that doesn't have salvation or security, they might want to think over things second.
I'll give one bit of advice to people, and that's this. Hard times breed strong people. While easy times breed soft people. And when you have soft people that are used to easy times and they suddenly encounter hard times, they're not strong enough to get through it. Their minds fail and their hearts fail. And so I strongly encourage Christian families, teach your children to anticipate hard times. So that when those hard times come, they'll be strong enough and their faith is grounded enough to get them through it. If our children are raised in easy times and they're used to being soft, then they'll be overwhelmed when, not if, but when the hard times come.
Right.
So verse 10 to 12, people are going to hate one another. Lawlessness will increase and their love will grow cold. He's warning us of this so that in the midst of lawlessness and suffering, we can still keep our wits about us and keep our spiritual direction and still be loving to people. When there's a lawless time, people get very cold and there's not a lot of love. If I'm afraid every time I walk outdoors that I'm going to get mugged or killed or something stolen from me or attacked, I get very fearful. I get closed in. I get hard. And when everybody's like that, it makes society a very miserable place to live.
And we're seeing lawlessness increase. You know, one of the things are their security cameras virtually everywhere these days, and even some governments actually put up cameras so that they can monitor the crime and go back and solve a crime. But we're through these security cameras, and we're seeing people that are going up in broad daylight and just shooting people or killing people, and it's cold, right? They're called cold-blooded killers for a purpose. And so you got to ask and question, what is our society going to? What is it whenever we just have this lawlessness that even in the daytime? I mean, many, many years ago, I started staying in at nighttime because that's when all the lawless people mostly came out at nighttime. Now it's creeping into the daytime, even just filling up gas at gas stations and things. So you have to be aware. But
I think we mentioned one other time, Steve, both you and I, when we were kids, we didn't lock our doors.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
And my grandfather and great-grandfather's generation, their houses didn't even have locks.
Yeah.
And so in that relatively short amount of time till today, now we have just senseless mass shootings, just random killings for no reason than random killings.
Right.
And we've gone from a nation within 2 or 3 generations that didn't have locks on their doors, and when they did have them, they didn't use it, to a point now where we're afraid to go anywhere because of random killings.
Right.
So this is what he's talking about. Love is going to grow cold.
Right.
And the reason is because we've walked away from God. Verse 13, he who endures to the end will be saved. Mm-hmm. Here, Jesus is not talking about spiritual salvation. He's not saying if you endure something like this persecution, then your salvation will be secure with the Lord. No. Right. That's not what he's saying. So what saved is he talking about here, Steve?
We'll come through the tribulation. I believe that, again, this is talking about mainly about the tribulation period, and that you're talking about those that are endured to the end of this tribulation. They're going to be saved. They're going to come in, because at the end of the tribulation, what comes next is the millennial kingdom, right? Jesus comes back, and then that kingdom is established. So I think that's what it's referring to here, enduring to the end, enduring through that tribulation period.
So verse 14 says, the gospel of the kingdom shall be preached to the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come.
Yeah.
And so we need to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah.
What he's saying here is that, and again, a verse is always in a context. The rest of this chapter is dealing with future end times events. We talked about that in previous sessions. We'll talk about it again as we go through the rest of the chapter. But since the whole chapter here is talking about these future end times events, this verse does also.
Right.
And so he's not talking about something that happened in the first century. He's talking about something that will happen at the end of days.
Yeah.
He's also not saying, he's not saying it's a cause and effect here. The logic is not here that says, if we go preach the gospel to all the nations, that's going to cause the end to come.
Right.
That's not what he's saying.
Right.
He's merely just saying, as an observation, once the gospel's preached to the whole world, after that, is going to be the time of the end.
Yeah, and because that dating there in regards to the time of the end, I believe that this is talking about that tribulation period. And we know that in that tribulation period, there's going to be 12,000 set aside from each tribe of the nation of Israel. And they're going to go out. They're going to be they're going to be protected. And they're going to be going out as witnesses to all the nations, to all the world. And of course, you'll have the 2 great witnesses as well. But I think that's a reference here, in that during that time at that great tribulation, even while all of that's going on, there's going to be people that are going to be protected from God, going out and preaching that, hey, you can have salvation. The kingdom of Christ is coming, and they're still going to have opportunity to come to salvation, spiritual salvation, during that tribulation period.
Before we move on to the next section, just want to summarize something here because we don't want to lose sight of the main point. Verse 5, many will come in my name and saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead many.
Yeah.
Verse 11, many false prophets will arise and will mislead many.
Right.
And so he's saying here, watch out. There's going to be a lot of deception. There's going to be a lot of rumors and fear in society about wars and all these problems. And so don't follow these false prophets that's going to come and say, oh, go over here, go over there. No. Stay the course. Stay with the true God, the true Christ. There's going to be some hard times ahead, but we can trust our Bibles. We don't need to listen to some modern day prophet,
right?
Because they're going to be a false prophet. Listen to the Word of God that's already been written. That's where we get our stability.
I don't think there's going to be any new revelation. I think that it's all recorded. We have it in our Bibles, and that we know what's going to happen.
Any new revelation is going to be a false revelation.
Right.
Okay, next passage starts in verse 15. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. For whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things that are in the house. Whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on a Sabbath. For then there will be great tribulation, such as not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short.
Right.
And so, Steve, we mentioned briefly in one of the earlier sessions about the discussion on whether this was something that happened in 70 AD
right.
or whether it's a future time.
Right.
So we don't want to spend as much time as we did already, but just to summarize, why do we say that's a future event and not a first century thing?
Well, there's been the temple has been desecrated before in the past, right? And in different ways, and those have been types, but it hasn't been during a period that's described as this tribulation period, where you have a 7-year period, 3.5 years peace at first, 3.5 years of really, really bad tribulation at the end. That's the abomination of desolation that is spoken of in Daniel. That is talking about in that specific time period of the Great Tribulation, the 70th week of Daniel. So that's what really dates this here that Jesus is talking about. So he's talking about that specific time in that 7-year tribulation period when that abomination of desolation takes place in the holy place, which is at the 3.5-year mark of this 7-year period. So we know that this is something that is still yet to happen because it hasn't happened yet.
So verse 15 talks about this abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place.
Right.
What is the holy place?
Well, you had the temple, and you had the holy place, and the first part of it that had the different elements, the showbread, the lampstand, the incense. Okay. And then behind that, you had separated by a curtain, you had what was referred to as the Holy of Holies. That's where the Ark of the Covenant was. And that's where the priest would go in once a year and sprinkle the blood on the mercy seat of the Holy of Holies. It was the place where God actually dwelt when they came out of Egypt in the tabernacle. That was that Holy of Holies place. And also when they first built the temple and transferred the tabernacle over into the first temple. So it was a place where God dwelt. And so now we have this Antichrist, sometimes referred to as the beast, the son of perdition, setting up, first of all, declaring himself to be God. And where else is he going to do that other than in the actual temple?
Yes.
And then the second part is putting up an idol to himself that the people have to worship.
So one of the clues for interpreting this Matthew 24 is right here in verse 15 when he talks about this abomination standing in the holy place.
Right.
And the holy place as Steve just mentioned, it's a technical name.
Mm-hmm.
It's a specific room that was mentioned. When he says the holy place, he's not talking about some random spot somewhere
Right.
that might be a holy spot somewhere. No. The holy place is a specific name of a room that was in the temple. And before that, back to Moses' day in the tent, the tabernacle,
Right.
it had to be designed a certain way, as Steve just said. And the holy place was the spot where the priest went to do the priestly work and sacrifice. And so it was a spot where only the priest could go.
Right.
Not even any Jew could go there. You had to be a priest,
Right.
and had to be consecrated for your service, and there were specific rules on what you could do. And no other object was allowed in
Right.
there. No other people was allowed in there. And what he's saying is that there will be some abomination, some horrible thing
Right.
that's going to be, again, the language here in verse 15, standing in the holy place.
Yeah.
And so one of the reasons we believe this has not yet happened is in 70 AD, yes, the Romans came in and destroyed the temple.
Right.
But they didn't set up a false image and leave the building up and say, you got to worship that.
Correct.
So that's what he's talking about, is the temple had to be still standing, and this false abomination had to be in this one room called the holy place. That didn't happen in the first century.
I also want to point out in verse 15, at the end of that, in parentheses, let the reader understand. This is emphasizing, this is something important.
Yes.
We shouldn't just read past it, okay?
He's saying pay attention.
Matthew has put it in there, right? And it's also in the other Gospels. Let the reader understand. So that, to me, signals me, wait a minute, hold up. I need to go back, look at this, and see exactly what it is that he's talking about.
Then in verse 21, there will be a great tribulation, such as not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. So this great tribulation he's talking about is going to be the worst one in all of history.
Right.
Well, 70 AD, when the Romans came in and destroyed Jerusalem, was very, very, very horrible. But the Holocaust in 1944 and 1945 killed more people in a more horrible way.
Right.
So, and we could imagine such a thing. I mean, you can imagine in your mind even more people being killed over a slower, more horrible time. And so these things haven't happened yet.
Right.
So that's why this section is dealing with end times things. And so just a reference, if you want to go look these things up, Daniel talks about these 70 weeks in Daniel chapter 9, specifically 9:27. He also mentions the abomination of desolation in 11:31 and 12:11 in Daniel.
Right.
But Daniel 9:27 is really kind of the key verse there. And so then he talks here, Steve, in Matthew 24. He's saying these things are going to happen kind of suddenly, right? The sense here is that it's going to be horrible. Verse 16, flee to the mountains.
Yep.
Those are on the housetop, don't go down to try to get your things. Whoever's in the field, don't go back to get your clothes. He's saying this is going to happen quickly. It's going to happen suddenly. People are going to be just going about their daily lives, and then, wow, it happens on them suddenly.
Right.
And so that's the sense, and this idea is carried through in other passages throughout the New Testament, is that these problems aren't going to just happen slowly, gradually over time. He mentioned before birth pangs.
Right.
So the birth pangs start out slow and far apart, and they get worse and worse and worse. But then, boom, this is here.
When they get to 5 minutes apart, that's when it's time to go to the hospital.
That's right. Have the baby in the back of the cab.
Yeah.
And so that's what he's saying here, is that hard times are coming. They're going to come suddenly. Just like a woman who's pregnant, she may be pregnant for 9 months, but suddenly that baby's coming suddenly, and it's here. And that's what he's really talking about here.
Right.
And then in verse 22, unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved. And I did a word study on that, and no life, what it really means is no life. It doesn't mean some life. It means no life.
Right.
And so that's why first century doesn't apply. This is something worldwide, cataclysmic, and it's dealing with something that the world has never seen before. This is the Great Tribulation period, the 70th week of Daniel that he talks about back in Daniel chapter 9. Any last things on that, Steve, before we read the next section?
No, I think we've covered it pretty well.
And he again, in verse 24, again talks about false Christs and false prophets will arise. So he's again saying, don't be deceived. You're going to have false prophets and false Jesuses that stand up and show what? Great signs and wonders, so as to mislead, even possible, the elect. And so what happens, Steve, if somebody stands up and says, well, I'm from God and here's my miracle?
Shouldn't believe them.
Look at what they're teaching.
Yeah.
Back in the Old Testament, the Mosaic Law said, even if somebody does a real miracle, if they're teaching about a different God,
right,
stone them to death.
Yeah.
That was the Old Testament law.
Yeah.
So even if the miracle was legitimate, even if you have a prophet that actually does foretell the future, and this is a lot of what we see today, is you'll have prophets, quote unquote, that foretell the future. And so what this is telling us in the Old Testament and here is even if you have somebody that stands up and accurately does predict the future in a miraculous way or does any other kind of miracle, look at their teaching.
Yeah.
And if their teaching doesn't line up with what the scripture has already told us, don't follow them.
Right.
Don't believe them. Even if the prophecy came true, even if it's a true miracle, don't believe them.
Right. Yeah. And that's why we should know what the scriptures say so that we will be able to know whether or not what they're teaching is true and accurate.
And in verse 25, behold, I have told you in advance. So if they say to you, behold, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. Or behold, he's in the inner rooms, do not believe them. For just as lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. So what is he saying here with this lightning going from one end of the sky to the other? What's the point?
Well, if you've ever been outside during a lightning storm, it's up in the sky and you'll see the great flashes, and sometimes they'll come from above down to the ground, but they're quick, they're loud, they're noticeable. You can't miss them because it's completely dark, and all of a sudden you have this bright light from the lightning that lights up the sky, lights up the ground around it. And so this is something that's going to be noticeable. It's an illustration that it's whenever it happens, it's going to be something that everybody sees and everybody notices. It'll be quick, but it's going to be something that everybody sees.
So it's going to be so dramatic, nobody's going to miss it.
Yeah.
And if somebody's around that misses it, then it didn't happen.
Right.
So the reason I say that is because there's been people that have claimed, oh, Jesus came back. He's over here.
Right.
Jesus came back. He's leading our group. Jesus came back. He's invisible, but his spirit's here.
Yeah.
And this verse is saying, no. Jesus is saying, when I come back, it's going to be so obvious, nobody's going to miss it. It's just like if you're standing outside at night and lightning goes completely across one end of the sky to the other. Nobody's going to miss it.
Right.
It's going to be so obvious that everybody's going to know. So if there's anybody around that doubts whether Jesus came back, he didn't.
Right. So I think possibly one of the things that you're saying, Glenn, let me ask you this. You're saying is that we have historical records, as we've noted before. We have secular historians that have recorded things that have happened during the first century, and during that documented what happened in Jerusalem in 70 AD and the revolts that happened after it and the Jewish people. Those things have been documented. We don't see any historical documentation of a great cataclysmic event such as this that's happened before. Is that kind of what you're also saying?
Not on this scale.
Yeah.
Not on the scale of what he's about to give us here in the rest of this chapter.
And if it was something that was that great, that it would have been documented. It would have been something that would have been documented.
Correct.
Yeah.
And so probably a good spot to pause. They're right in the middle of this great section. And so I hesitate to stop right here, but the clock is still ticking. And so to be wise with our time, let's go ahead and hit the pause button for today. And so the lesson for today, just before we leave, is that don't panic. There's going to be hard times coming, but God knows about it. He's in control. And us and our children need to be strong enough to know that when hard times come, we can trust our Bibles, trust what Jesus has told us. Don't believe the false prophets, because the good news is the true Jesus is going to come back and will be a glorious day. And that's what we learn when we reason through the Bible.